So, yeah, just let us know when you're out and then maybe well, we're about to go back into the
Yeah. So, you know.
Maybe don't ask me again.
Thank you. I'd like to call us back to order. Okay, so here's the plan. I see that Brittany from Forvis is on the line. Brittany, welcome. We're glad that you're here and have been waiting for your information, so that's good. Jason, Brittany is on the line. I think what we'll do, Congress, if this is acceptable, we're going to go to lunch. We'll break from lunch at 12:30. From 12:30 to 1:30. This should give Brittany enough time to give us an update on the ARPA projects. We only have her for a bit. She's not able to stay the entire day. So I want to make sure that she has enough time to provide the information to us that we need. Yes, Congresswoman.
Speaker Shaw, can I make the request maybe that we hear a full report from, what's her last name, Miss Luganville? That we hear the full report from Ms. Luganville before we ask questions so we can get through it and then come back and ask questions. Would that be an okay request to make?
I think that's a good idea. Let's first allow her to get through the items that she needs to talk about since we have a limited amount of time with her. So I think that would be a good way to proceed. Mr. Zahn.
Yes, ma'am. Brittany, Rebecca has emailed you the spreadsheet that we're looking at for your convenience to assist.
Hey, thank you all for having me. Jason, I do not have that spreadsheet, but I believe I probably have a sufficient
Okay.
Starting point. If you would let me know where you want to start, if you want to start with capital asset activity or if you want to start with more of the operational type projects, I'd be happy to jump in anywhere.
In capital, please.
Certainly. Okay, so is this, Jason, is this the same kind of listing that we were looking at last week?
Yes, I believe so. We just updated it last night.
Okay, great. So I do not have that updated spreadsheet, so my numbers may be just slightly different, but I'm pretty sure we're very, very close to the same page. So as far as I'm aware, my numbers are accurate through August 26th and may not include anything that's happened since that date. So as far as the capital asset activity, do you want to go project by project here?
Yes, ma'am, please.
Sure. Okay, so Hominy Senior Housing, that project is fully obligated under ARPA and expects to be fully utilized. I don't believe that we're expecting any additional funds to be needed there on the ARPA side. I do know that is one project that is funded by multiple funding sources, and so there may be some activity outside of the ARPA project that's still ongoing there. Pawhuska Water Infrastructure, Gray Horse Water Infrastructure, and Hominy Water Infrastructure. Jason, forgive me, I don't know if there's been subsequent conversations after what we discussed last week, but there are funds available, I believe, on Pawhuska and Hominy that we expect to have available to reallocate to other ARPA obligations. I believe the Gray Horse Water Infrastructure allocation is expected to be fully utilized.
Yes, and additionally, there was a discussion right before you came on, as there's a contract that needs potentially $770,000 more additional dollars outside to complete the entire project, but it's set up into phases so we can complete most of the extra work with just what we have now.
Great. Fairfax Senior Housing, that facility has been finished. Our obligation was fully utilized there. I don't think there's anything to continue on that. The primary residential treatment campus, there is a small amount of funding available to reallocate on that project from the ARPA pot. The two subawards to subrecipients, Osage Innovative Solutions for their assistance with the broadband expansion and the City of Barnsdall for their water infrastructure projects, those expect to be fully spent. They are fully obligated as far as your ARPA obligations are concerned, and the subrecipients are on track to spend all of that funding in compliance with the award. The assisted living facility, that project does expect to utilize the full ARPA obligation. I believe there is an additional need there. If there is opportunity to reallocate funding there is additional need on that facility project. The HVAC upgrades across multiple buildings and locations, that project is complete. There is funding available to reallocate on that project. The MidCon building, there is the expectation that that obligation is going to be fully utilized. There is also an additional, as we left off last week, an additional unknown need on that project, but they do expect to fully utilize the original $600,000 appropriation on that project. The Hominy and Gray Horse Chapel expansions, both of those projects will have ARPA funding available to reallocate on those. And the child care facility is another project that is funded by multiple funding sources, but the ARPA obligation will be fully utilized on that project. And then there are a couple of capital asset projects that are funded out of that revenue replacement $10 million bucket that's available. So the legislative building, there's a chunk of money on that one that's available to reallocate. The funeral home, I believe that one is going to be available to reallocate as well. And the judicial building, the ARPA obligation $6 million that was assigned there is expected to be fully utilized. And there may be an additional need on that project for ARPA obligations to potentially be reallocated to.
Okay.
Thank you, Brittany. Is that all the information that you wanted to present to us?
So that's everything on the capital asset side of activity. So you do have some ongoing operational type projects for the museum language and culture departments, the food sovereignty programs, and some of the IT categories as well. I'm not sure, I don't have the best scope on what is expected for operations for those programs for calendar 2025 and calendar 2026. And I know that Rebecca has done a lot of work on those, and she will probably have more information on those. But I do believe that they expect to utilize the full ARPA obligation on most of those projects.
Thank you. Members, what questions do you have for Brittany now that we have her on the line? Regarding, yes. Mr. Frazier?
I was just wondering if those operational budgets, because some of it's wages and things like that, that wouldn't be contractual obligations. Can we continue using those to fund those operational budgets through 2026?
Yeah, that's correct. So typically those would not be considered contractual obligations. That's a great question. So one of the flexibilities that the Department of Treasury has given recipients as it relates to things like salaries and other non-contractual costs is the ability to enter into an interagency agreement. And so that would essentially be an agreement between your Department of Treasury and that department that's operating those programs to say, we are going to obligate this amount of funding for your operating costs for this period, and we're going to agree to use that for a scope of work that is in compliance with the use of the funds under the award. And an agreement that is structured that meets all of those requirements can be considered an obligation for the definition under this award. And so that, I think, is the approach that's planned to be taken to address that.
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Frazier.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Could, say there were funds left over in one of the capital projects, could those be reallocated to pay operating expenses at Butcher House or Harvest Land for the upcoming fiscal years?
Yep. So as long as there is an existing obligation that has to be in place as of 12/31/24 in order to reallocate funding. And so as long as that interagency agreement is in place as of 12/31/24, after that date, you can reallocate any surpluses on other projects to that existing obligation. It just has to be in place by the end of this calendar year. So the recommendation would be to estimate high on that.
Rebecca, you have the floor.
Brittany, can you go into a little bit more detail? I just want to make sure that the caveat explained with the Butcher House and Harvest Land when we talk about program income as well as leftover funds and how that becomes restricted. I just want them to be able to have a good grasp from you guys.
Certainly. Yeah, so program income for this award is added to your federal award. And so that means that you are required to use that for purposes consistent with the grant purpose, right? And so operations for all these programs is going to fit in line with that requirement. But the program income adds to your award. And so whatever expenditures are allocated against that program income, right, that is effectively kind of a net zero effect. And so the program income increases your award, you apply the expenditures against it, and therefore you haven't actually reduced your unobligated balance through the use of that program income. So that is the one thing just to keep in mind, that if your operating budget does not exceed program income, then you're actually not going to be reducing your unobligated balance on these projects.
Thank you. Congresswoman Redcorn.
Thank you, Speaker. Brittany, could you quickly go over the, I was trying to mark next to the things that you said might need a reallocation of funds added to them. I have marked the child care facility, and I believe you said maybe the judicial building just might need some movement. I can't remember what the other ones were that you said.
So the judicial building was on the list. Let me see here. The assisted living facility and the MidCon building were the three that I had on my list as potentially needing additional funding. The child care facility, that's one that is funded by multiple funding sources. And so the ARPA obligation is fully utilized. I'm not sure that there is an additional need on that one. I'll let either Jason or Rebecca speak to that one.
Rebecca.
This list I have in front of me is specific to ARPA. I don't want to speak on something that I can't stand 10 toes on this portion. My understanding is that there will not be any more funding needed, but I would need to move that through Claire and also through our tribal development to get some clarity on that. I know there is additional funding. It's broken out between federal awards. I believe there might even be like a LATCF grant associated with it as well. But one caveat I want to add to that as well when we're talking about the WILA is it was funded partially with ARPA funds. So what that means is any money that we receive as far as program income then comes restricted. I know it's a partial amount, but that money will become restricted and need to be allocated right back into the WILA. I don't know if that answers some questions.
And that requirement is only effective through the end of calendar 2026. After that point, any income you earn is unrestricted.
Congressman Keene. I apologize. I thought you did. Congresswoman Rivard, you're on the list.
Speaker, my question to Brittany is on this report, the ones has an unappropriated amount of $43,243. And so our unappropriated amount, I think that we last discussed was around 9,000, I believe. So that tells me then we might have received some ARPA dollars we may not have, that has not been sent down through this branch to get appropriated. Am I seeing that correctly?
So I can speak to what I know about the 43,000. So your total bucket of revenue replacement funds is 10 million, right? Because you chose to take the standard allowance, which is a good decision because that calculation is a beast. And so 750,000 was appropriated for the legislative building, 3 million was appropriated for funeral homes, 6 million was appropriated for judicial buildings. So that kind of left an undefined 250,000 of that 10 million, right? And so a portion of that has been dipped into on other appropriations. I mean, I don't have a clear picture of what those dips are, but of that 250,000, 206,000 has been obligated. And so that 43,000 is kind of just your leftover bucket of what is unspoken for of that 10 million revenue replacement bucket.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Next, I have Congresswoman Goodfox. Okay. Yes, Mr. Song, go ahead.
Brittany, can we circle back and just touch on the visitor center? I didn't hear discussion about that.
Sure. Yeah, sorry for that. So the visitor center in the ARPA report is grouped up under a consolidated project for the museum language and culture projects as a whole. And so that is grouped into that project on my listing. So let me bear with me for just a second. Let me pull back up. It looks like I've just gotten the file from Rebecca. So let me pull that up, and that way I can talk to what you have on your file here. Okay, and I think that is the museum exhibit. The original appropriation was 375,324. Is that correct, Jason?
We're talking about the visitor center of 1.545 for the construction at our visitor center. It's the 8th one down.
Thank you. Okay, so on that list, it looks like we have unobligated funds of 15,000, and I do believe that project is 100% complete, so that 15,000 would be available for reallocation.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, thank you, Jason.
Congresswoman Rickhorn.
Thank you, Speaker. So now you've got my brain thinking about all the programs that we have put ARPA money into that are now going to have restricted revenue. So can you list for me or us all the things on this list that we need to consider restricted revenue for going forward?
I can do the best to answer that question as I can from my kind of outsider view of what is earning program income. So my understanding is it would be both the senior housing facilities, it would be the PRT once programs are starting to happen at that campus. It would be the child care facility, assisted living, most likely if there is going to be program fees on that. And this is only for anything that comes in between now and the end of 2026. But the food sovereignty programs, so any sales at the Butcher House, Harvest Land, those operations. Those are the big ones.
Speaker, if I may, is because our visitor center generates revenue also, but when we built it with ARPA funds, is it also going to be in that category?
I would expect so, yes.
Thank you, Congressman Keene.
Yeah, thank you for being on the call. So
it's the Department of Treasury that would have the power to extend the deadline at the end of 26 for us to spend these funds. Is that accurate?
That is true, yes.
Okay, one other question. This kind of gets in the weeds legally. So there was a recent SCOTUS case, Supreme Court, where they struck down Chevron deference, where, now they're saying that Congress has to come in, where, normally the courts would defer to the administrative agency interpreting the law. So I'm wondering, would that apply in this case where you'd actually have to have Congress extended, or do you think the Treasury would still have that power? I'm honestly not sure. So
Yeah,
go
that's a
ahead.
good question, and I am not a legal expert, so I will caveat that with that is not my area of expertise to provide advice on. But I would expect that the decision would be Treasury's to make in this case. There has not, to my knowledge, been any Congress involvement in how Treasury has been managing this award to date. So that would be my expectation.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for all your
Certainly.
help.
Congresswoman Good Fox.
Well, would the visitor center be included in that? Because the visitor center was already established and our ARPA use of funds was to expand for social distancing. And so we already were in a business type sense when we used the ARPA money with the intent to expand to let people not be so close quarters.
Yep, that's a good question. I would have to go back and maybe do a little bit of research on that. I don't want to give you a affirmative answer one way or the other. I think there could be some room for judgment on that, but I would have to kind of go back and look at the guidance and see if they've given a very just by the book typical the government's definition of program income, and that is essentially any income that is earned on a project that is funded by federal dollars. And so I think you could potentially make a case that the facility was there, it existed previously, the improvements were made only for the purposes of social distancing and accommodating those needs due to the pandemic. I think I would have to chew on that one a little bit.
I have a follow-up.
Go ahead.
And then also, so based off of this list and you seem to have a very firm grasp of where we were, where we're at now, and what off of this list that's been appropriated do you see as red flag type of an analysis, if you would, of what hasn't been started, that's been obligated, given the deadline of this year, that we need to probably be spending our time talking about more than what's already been 100% complete? What are the 2 or 3 things that you see on this list, given the deadline, that you're like, hey, you guys better make a decision and move it?
Yeah, I think that the initial projects that come to mind on that are the water infrastructure projects, because those are big capital projects that require time to expend, right? But I think that there's been a lot of discussions already around how to effectively fund those so that there's not a risk of losing the money. And it sounds like the decisions are leaning towards shifting those funds. And so those would be my initial red flags, but I think that there's been a lot of conversation around how to address those flags already. So outside of those, I think your big unobligated balance on the operational side right now is in the food sovereignty programs and the museum language and culture projects. And that's not to say that those won't be obligated by the end of the year and then be able to spend them by the end of 2026. But I do think that, especially with the food sovereignty programs, having program income effectively funding your operating budget on those, as it sat as of the end of August, there was, I think, 1.5 in the ballpark of 1.5 million unobligated on that project. And so that's 1.5 million that, and I don't know I don't have kind of the back end understanding of what the secretary's plans are for that 1.5 million, but as far as I see it right now, that's not under contract. It's not going to be covered by program income, and so that's probably your risk area is those two.
Okay, so I have a follow-up. So not things that are at 40, like 44% or 40%. So what about like the funeral home and assisted living?
Yeah, so assisted living, my understanding is that is, it is under contract now. And so, and I think they've got a good plan for getting that spent. So that has not been raised to me as an area of concern. It's a big project and certainly one that, you're definitely going to have to stay on top of it to get it spent by the end of 2026. But I think there's a plan in place for that. And so was it the legislative building was the other one that you said?
No, the funeral home.
The funeral home. Yeah, so I know that that's one that has come up in conversations, and the A&E has been ongoing, and there's some concern about whether the construction can be contracted and then completed and utilized by the end of 2026, and that is probably the other capital asset project that likely needs to be adjusted or addressed in some way.
Thank you.
Congresswoman Redcorn, go ahead.
Thank you, Speaker. Brittany, I kind of want to piggyback on the first question that Congresswoman Goodfox had mentioned about the revenue being restricted for the visitor center. And so I wonder if when you're doing that research too, our WheeLa would be the same, the child care facility would have been the same idea. We already had one and it was an operating program before we built the new facility with the ARPA dollars. So I'm curious then if we can do a little research into figuring out if there's a way, if that rule still applies to that as well. So because the same mindset it would be the same mindset for the visitor center and the WheeLa because we had those two existing streams of revenue before this.
Sure. Yep, I can look into that. I will say the one difference that comes to mind in those two scenarios is the WheeLa Center is a new building, and the Treasury has been very nitpicky in their guidance around new construction. And there's been a lot of flexibility given to tribes in regard to that. But there's just a little bit of nuances in the guidance as it relates to new construction.
Thank you. Any other questions? Mr. Zahn?
Brittany, is that all that we have on your side that you're taking a look at? Do we need anything else we need to talk about on this spreadsheet that we have in front of us?
Yeah, I do believe that is the majority of the big ticket items that I think are important to discuss today. I will say the one other thing that I just would like to share as it relates to that revenue replacement bucket. So any that 10 million is generally available for any government service, and so that 10 million can be allocated to whatever's left over on, should you choose to reallocate what's left on the funeral home and the legislative building, can be allocated to any of your existing projects, even though it's currently in your revenue replacement bucket. However, if you allocate funding to the judicial building, that has to come from the 10 million revenue replacement. So that is the only nuance within that bucket that I just would like to emphasize.
Thank you.
Members? No other questions? Mr. Zahn, do you feel like we've covered everything we need to with Ms. Brittany?
I believe so. Brittany, do you feel the same as I do?
I do. Thank you very much for having me. And I will be available tomorrow if other questions come up as you're processing that information. So
thank you very much, Brittany.
Thank you for your time, Mr. Zahn. Well, let me ask the body. It is 12:07. Do we want to go ahead and go to lunch at 12:15, or go now and recess for lunch until 1, then come back and finish? Okay. Well, we will recess for lunch without objection until 1 o'clock.